You are listening to a Modern Nonprofit Podcast, a podcast for leaders of today's nonprofits. We focus on the most pressing issues in a modern nonprofit, from grant writing and fundraising to back office administration like accounting. If you are looking for tips and hacks to make your nonprofit more modern and intentional, you've come to the right place. I'm your host, Tosha Anderson. I've worked with hundreds of nonprofits over many years in different capacities. First as an auditor, then a CFO of a nonprofit, and now I'm a CPA that owns the Charity CFO, an accounting firm working exclusively with nonprofit organizations. I'm passionate about trying to make the work of nonprofits even easier through the most modern practices I've learned from some of our most successful clients. Keep listening. Hey friends, welcome back. We are starting another episode of a Modern Nonprofit Podcast. I'm Tosha Anderson, your host. And today I have a really interesting guest here. Sarah, you are a former executive director of a nonprofit. You are a founder. You are now a consultant that's worked with lots and lots and lots of nonprofits. And when we were chatting, we were talking about some work that you've been doing for many, many years working with the nonprofit space. But you've created kind of a framework to help nonprofit organizations better run their organizations. We're going to talk about some interesting topics today. But Sarah, I wanted to first thank you for coming on board and having this conversation. We're going to be talking about boards and budget, and whether you should be having a budget approved and other things maybe as it relates to boards, depending on how this conversation comes on board. So, Sarah, you are the CEO and founder of a company called Pivot Ground. Tell us a little bit more about Pivot Ground and what that does for nonprofits.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me here. Pivot Ground has evolved into, I like to kind of call it a training, coaching, consulting organization for nonprofits. I started out doing a lot of marketing consulting, which led me very quickly into how to help nonprofits run better, because most organizations I met couldn't run well enough to take advantage of great marketing. They couldn't operate consistently and quickly, which you really need to do to take advantage of a lot of opportunities. And that led me to be a very reluctant consultant, because I really believe so much in, train someone to fish rather than give them a fish. And so I created this method. And so most of my work is teaching nonprofits how to run their organizations better by using this framework that works again and again. And then coaching and training to help leaders just come along and grow, because I love to be supportive and help mostly CEOs of nonprofits. But of course, the CEO touches on everything. So we end up touching on budgeting and board management and hiring and all those things, which is very satisfying to help somebody with once they have a framework to actually get it all done. And so that's what our work looks like today. It's mostly working with CEOs, and I have really come to enjoy in this past year also beginning to do some board trainings so that boards can really be making a lot of forward progress with the organization and not holding the organization back, which unfortunately I see happening too often.
A lot to unpack today. I'm really energized and excited about this, because as I was mentioning before I hit record on this episode, that I am a board member. I've been board members with various organizations. I work with lots of boards. I work with lots of nonprofits. And when you spoke of, you're just trying to do some marketing consulting, and then you realize, some of the operations or the leadership or how the organization is ran impacts this area, and it's all interrelated, right? And I work with nonprofits on the financial and accounting side of things, and all of that is very interrelated. And all the way from the top, all the way down, right? Operationally, at the very day-to-day activities, all the way up to kind of board leadership and oversight. So, speaking of accounting and finance, let's just dive right into a conversation we were having online about the budget. You have been advising your clients to eliminate their board approval process for budget.
Yeah,
that's a shocking statement, I would think, for many people listening. So why shouldn't there be a board approval process for the budget? We'll just kind of start there and see where the conversation goes.
Sure. Well, I kind of came to this, not to be a shocker, but having been a board member and been a CEO and seeing my clients struggle with this budget approval process that creates for CEOs, for executive directors, all this tension. And I just started asking myself, what is our real intent here? What are we really approving when we approve a budget? Like, what level of detail are we approving? And getting down into like the real nitty gritty, right? Because we've both been there, right? So like, if an executive director brings a budget to the table that has a lot of detailed line items and you say you approve that budget, are you approving all the detailed line items? Are you just approving the big line items? Are, what is it really at the end of the day when the board votes and says they approve it? What are they even approving?
Right.
We're asking that question. Like, what does it mean? How much flexibility is in there? And then I start thinking maybe boards should be approving certain health ranges, which I never see boards do. Like, how much assets do we want to retain as far as like a percentage of our operating expenses? Or, I like to think of Luna, liquid, unrestricted net assets, things that can become cash if you need them. Right. And, or like how much, how aggressive do we want to be with spending our money to get a result? And I start thinking that maybe thinking in ranges of the kind of risk we're comfortable with to the reward we're getting might be a better approach. But at the same time, I was seeing something else. I was seeing that whether or not a particular board approved a budget was more about how good a presenter the CEO was than how good a financial plan the budget represented. And probably like you, like I'm all about making an impact, right? And getting results. So I want the whole conversation around the budget, regardless of who's having it, to be about, is this a good financial plan? Is this the best way to be spending money to either be bringing in more money or making a really big impact? Or when things are really great, we're doing both at the same time, right? Every dollar is bringing in more money and making a big impact. And so I came to all of this like from that conversation of what are we really doing here? What do we really want this budget approval conversation to be about? And I'll just kind of stop there because I want to see like if you've related this, and then I'll like
I feel attacked there. I feel attacked because I will say I remember back in the day before I started this firm 6.5 years ago, I was the CFO of a nonprofit. And it's really funny because I had to go to the board, and if you're large enough, you might be a CEO that presents the budget, but in larger organizations, you have a CFO that usually presents the budget. And I remember that I would go into those conversations anticipating every question that they could possibly answer. And some of these are good conversations and good questions, and some of these are pretty surface level, like I can kind of and I would present with those questions in mind so that you get the nod and, everybody's in agreement. That sounds good. And there would be very few questions and the check off, right? And I'm not just saying about the board too. I mean, funders, we've had conversations about, our funders really asking the right questions to understand if these organizations are actually financially sound. And I wholeheartedly believe in the presentation, the quality of the presentation. Thought of it from that perspective, but I like to think I'm usually pretty good at winging it and pretty good at knowing my numbers that I could give the answer. And it's interesting too. I've gone into conversations where you have to be very thoughtful about the words that you use because you don't want them to be inflammatory or create unnecessary hysteria at the board level because they don't necessarily know all the components. And it's not that you're hiding anything, but you're very intentional about the words that you choose, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't want them to freak out that we, gave a 6% increase to our salaries in our salary pool, but we're kind of, minimizing the fact that our largest funder is up for renewal and we're not certain what their priority areas are going to be. And we don't know what that's going to look like, right? There's always more to the story. There's all the things to the story that you could spend hours, days really dissect all the details. So I absolutely relate to that. There's far more details than any board member will ever be able to dive into. And I work with some boards that really do roll up their sleeves and really want to understand all of that. And then others just really micromanage the details, to your point. Others just really want to know very high level, what are the objectives we're trying to achieve with this financial plan? Although that's not often the case, but and there's a whole spectrum of to your point, what are we getting out of this? But what are we trying to achieve here? And sometimes I think we're going to ask enough questions to feel like we've done our due diligence and we're going to sign off on it, but we don't really understand it. I've seen all of those things, but I can really relate to the presenter because I found myself in that position so many times. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen, done a lot of coaching with nonprofit leaders, whether they were CEOs or CFOs, like you said, it's whoever is presenting. Some executive is going to present. And not all of them are great presenters. That doesn't, you don't have to be. It is a really good skill to acquire as a leader. But many nonprofit leaders get there without being great presenters. And many of them are presenters, but they're not necessarily comfortable with money. And I think the theme that's emerging for me here, which is the theme that I think nonprofits should be thinking about, is how we can have meaningful conversations around money. And one thing that was starting to make me very uncomfortable with my clients is their conversations around their budgets with me, and they're working on their budgets, and I'm reviewing things prior to their board seeing them, is the majority of the conversation was, I don't think my board's going to approve that, right? I don't think they're going to let me do that. And here they're thinking it's a good financial idea, and I'm agreeing this is a good financial idea. And I'm like, if the consultant and the CEO and all the executives at the organization are thinking this is a good idea, and we're just sitting around talking about how we can make this digestible or palatable to the board, that doesn't seem like a very good use of CEO time or my time. And so I decided to kind of run an experiment with my clients who I have a very good trusting relationship with, and have them try just eliminating the budget approval meeting process. So what happens instead is they present the budget as a financial plan, as an estimate, as a set of ideas around, money that's being spent to bring in more money or to make an impact. And the board looks at it and they can ask questions, and the board is monitoring the finances year round, but the board just never takes a vote to say they approve it or not. The executive team, the executive director no longer has to worry about their board saying no or, to this important plan. I mean, being able to spend money well is very important as a leader because you get to take advantage of opportunities, right? It's literally how you run almost everything in your organization. And what emerged is that first, the CEO and executive teams stopped worrying about what the board would think. And the majority of the conversation immediately became, is this the best way to spend our money to achieve our goals? That became the focus. And that's the focus that I want the budget conversation to be about. The best way to spend our money to achieve our goals. And interestingly, this one really surprised me. The board members were more engaged in the conversation about the finances in a meaningful way, wanting to know more, wanting to understand, and also wanting to understand how this budget was going to help them achieve their goals. And I think what happened there that I wasn't, in hindsight, I realized is that most board members are kind of nervous to be liable for this budget because really, like if you're not into the day-to-day of how money is exactly working in this organization, you don't really know if version A or version B is the better way to spend the money, right? You can kind of do some basic understanding, but to really go to make a decision, to decide whether or not this is how you're going to do it, that's a lot to put on a board who are part-time volunteers. Even if they, I want to ask to you, as being the professional in nonprofit finances that you are, if you're on a board and you're not that organization's financial professional, how much are you able to make your financial decisions for them?
Right.
Like even as a consultant, right? Like I have to leave most of the final decisions to my clients because they're the ones with all the information.
Exactly.
Not the board members, not the consultant, and the person with all the information and the most at stake, right? Because CEOs, executives, they have a lot at stake. If they make terrible decisions, like everyone's watching and their jobs are on the line, not to mention that they care so passionately about their work. And so it was amazing to see. So let me go back. So the board members basically was terrifying for them to approve the budget. And therefore it was anxiety producing and stressful. And then their fear centers set in. And then they get in this kind of restrictive mindset about, well, should we approve that? Can we spend that? Because they're feeling so liable for something that they really have so little control over. And to release them from that made them better stewards of the organization, actually.
What's funny, Sarah, I am on a board for a nonprofit, and, by default with my background, I'm on the finance committee. And it's really funny because I just joined the board and was presented with all of the details that go into the budget. And there was no discussion at the finance committee. Now, I kind of slid in right when the budget was getting presented to the board as a whole, but I was given all the details prior to. But I mean, within weeks, we were presenting it to the board. So I wasn't presented the budget as a finance committee member initially. So I saw what the rest of the board members got, but I also had the background as well, some of the context. What's funny, there was no conversation really around what are the goals, what are the initiatives, what are we trying to achieve next year specifically, and how is this budget leading to that outcome, right? There's really no, which is funny because you would think an accountant, I'm like, ooh, show me all the spreadsheets and show me all the formulas. I'm like, I don't care about the details. I trust that you've all done the homework to know what the payroll taxes should be based on this budget and what your insurance rate renewal is going to be, all these things. Like, I'm going to trust that you've gone through all the details. What's the big picture? Where are we trying to go? And how does this really lead to that outcome, right? Which I think is surprising for people to hear from an accountant standpoint. I don't want to belabor all of the formulas and all the things, which I think most finance committee members feel like their responsibility is. But do we see a connection between the financial plan and our strategic plan? And are those things moving in the same direction? Or do we reasonably believe, to your point that you mentioned earlier, is this the best way to spend the money to hopefully get us into that direction? Now, anything in business with a for-profit, you're going to have to take risks. You're going to have leaps of faith. You're going to assume this is the best way to achieve the outcome. You could be wrong, but that's part of the game of business, right? Whether it's for-profit or nonprofit. And so often, it's funny, I just was having a conversation with a client of ours, and they were, mentioning, hey, we need to get with the board and we need to present the budget. Can you send that over? And I said, we haven't started the budget process yet because we haven't had any conversations about what you want to do next year and how next year is going to be different than this year. So I, as the accountant, I can't just put a budget together knowing that we've had other conversations about we anticipate a lot of big changes for your organization next year. But until we map out what those changes are going to be high level, how do we translate that into numbers? And I think so often we start with the numbers without starting with the why or the where. Yeah. And what direction are we going in?
It has to be the where or the why. I mean, I think at the end of the day, money is a tool, right? Like, and bookkeeping is how we confirm that we have the tool that we thought we had. And the rest of financial planning and running, scenarios is about envisioning how we're going to use this tool to get a result that we don't necessarily have direct control over. I mean, that's why it's so easy to talk about expenses and cutting expenses, but you can only go so far with that, right? Because it's a very direct correlation between, where we spend the money, right? How we use that tool and what actually happens. But a lot of the real conversation, the hard conversation and the important one is, how can we use money to get a result that we don't have as much direct control over, right? How can we get more money, right? Like, just because I spend money trying to get somebody to give me money doesn't mean it will work. And there's a lot of different ways I could do that. And I hate, I've seen so many organizations, they start with the numbers. And I'm like, we're going to have more fundraising revenue next year. And I want to know, oh yeah, like, what are you going to do differently? Like, are you hiring a development director? Are you changing your strategy? Are you going to rebrand? Are you going to, finally ditch this one way that's been very ineffective and start focusing on, let's say, major donors proven to be highly, highly effective. Like, what are you going to do? And if this is your first time doing that thing, like, I don't know, how good is that guess? Like, it may be good, it may be bad. Let's make sure we have a cushion so that if it turns out to be a bad guess, we have the chance to try again, right? Like,
right.
But it's just a tool, that we're
So we've talked about the traditional budget process and all the ways that's not effective. And I echo everything that you've experienced. I'm living it. It's like not really the way it should work. And, I can relate to that because I am a founder of my business and I put I call them projections, budget, whatever it might be. Let's call it a static budget, a fluid budget.
I just want to pause right there for everyone who's listening. Like, that is how I think of budgets. And I think like everyone should just turn off the word budget and turn on the word projection in its place right now. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no. And that's how we approach. But I'm curious to know what your client, other metrics when you were referencing, not just here's the budget, here's the revenues, here's the expenses, even though it's based on some arbitrary made up, 3% increase or 5% increase or whatever, based on no actual like anticipated changes in what we've been doing. How I approach my personal projections, I think about a variety of different things. Number one, I look at what is my capacity to even deliver services and how much do I want that to go up or down or stay the same next year, right? So I'm thinking about that as just like output or outcome, really output, I guess, really, and maybe outcomes for a program, fundraising or whatever in the speak of like nonprofit world. But then I think about, okay, how many people do I need to hire more to like make that a difference? And then other reinvestments I need to make. And going into 2023, I'm in the throes of doing budget or projections together for my own business. And I'm thinking about my theme next year is how to make them more consistent and like easier, right? So just more effective and efficiency, right? It's not that I'm necessarily trying to grow my ongoing capacity. I'm just trying to make everyone's life easier while we do this work. And interestingly enough, I also I manage those numbers to what's going to be left, right? And I get the whole idea I'm a for-profit versus nonprofit, but there needs to be some element of margin, and I'm sure you would agree with this. There needs to be that cushion that you talked about. Yeah. So we need to build some numbers around. There has to be a cushion. And then the other thing that we look at, and you had mentioned some other key indicators of financial health that my specific business looks at, is cash reserves in the bank. So if I want to do all of these things and I add all these assumptions in there, what are some of the other, you use the word Luna, like liquid unrestricted net assets, cash, or whatever it might be. Are there other indicators that we could be looking at outside of just revenues and expenses? Is it comparable to prior year? Is the increase, palatable for the board? What are some of the other things that your clients are using to kind of measure, yes, we think this is a revenue, yes, this is the expenses, but these are also numbers we're managing to each year to make sure this is a good finance for the organization? That's a very long question.
I hope that makes sense. Well, maybe in no particular order, I'll just share some of the things talk about watching out for. Well, one of which is so easy to change, like in your physical budget, is years ago I decided that as I saw people kind of monkeying around, their boards got focused on that bottom line, right? And then they just start finagling with the revenue at the top to make the bottom look good. Mm-hmm. So what I do instead is we have programmatic revenue at the top. And I always like, for me and my clients, to understand how much revenue is this program bringing in. And I usually count fees for services and restricted grants that are just for that programming. So if you didn't have the program, you wouldn't have that revenue, right? So that's program revenue. And I always then like to understand what are the costs coming, the direct program costs and also the direct program labor for that program. So we really can start to say, okay, I have 3 programs. Program A is great at making money and it makes a good impact, right? And we're always kind of balancing money and impact. Program B makes an amazing impact. Like it just loses money every year, but that's okay because it's worth it. And program C is good at making impact and equally good at making money. It basically just pays for itself, and that's lengthy too. So once we can look at each of our programs and then ask this question, is it good at making money? Is it good at making an impact, right? And what's the balance? worth it, right? So if it costs a lot of money, but it makes an amazing impact, then we can say, oh, well, it costs a lot and we got to do more fundraising. It makes an amazing impact and people are going to want to support this. Then all the rest of my fundraising income, I put it at the bottom, below all of the expenses, so that I can see what is the true cost of running this nonprofit business before any fundraising is done.
Sure.
And that very well may be a negative number. It's fine. There's no real judgment either way, but it lets you know your real fundraising target if you want to try or growing, and there's no monkeying around with it because it's just. And I think it's really important then with all those numbers to potentially be watching how you're changing year over year or looking for sudden ups or downs. I think a lot of numbers we watch, and I like to turn everything into percentages, right? Because numbers less than 100 are a lot easier for our brains to digest. So the whole dollar amount is important, but often we need to be comparing things to answer good financial questions. And so when you turn something into a percentage, then we're basically comparing apples to apples, and it's a lot easier. So then I like to have that fundraising number at the bottom, and we can kind of say, well, that is a goal, right? This program is going to at least, we need at least this much money to run all of our programs and all of our operations. So we better at least raise that much money. And then we can very easily measure how good are we at raising money, right? So I like to turn budgets into it's like a question and answer. We're having a conversation with our budget, right? We're asking it to tell us things.
Yeah.
So that's really important. I really encourage all of my clients to break out their programmatic budgets in separate tabs in a spreadsheet, and then import some of their impact metrics and dollarize them is like what I call it. So however you can measure it, I've had clients who run like a homeless day shelter. They can only measure the number of people served per day. They doesn't make sense for them to track the same person and whether or not they got that person to housing, because there's a lot of anonymity that goes on in homeless shelters. So, but at least they can say, this is how many people we serve per day on average or per week on average. And then they can take the dollars and say it costs us X number of dollars per day per person. And now they can compare that. So you're in, we go through, and then, so let me just step back and say, I think it's really important financially to understand, are we in growth mode? Or did we just grow and now we're in like streamline mode so we can turn growth into scale, right? So if you're in growth mode, I think you should be investing money, trying experiments, have enough reserves to cover your butt for failed experiments. That's the name. If you're in kind of scale refine mode, then you're probably spending money, not so much on just throwing spaghetti at the wall, but on refining systems and processes, which is not a very exciting thing to do, although the results are amazing, right? And you're thinking about, maybe I want to hire a consultant, or maybe I want to upgrade my software, right? And we're going to spend money on those types of activities. And then we're looking at, okay, it takes, $20 to serve one person for one day. Can we get that down to 15, right? Like,
yeah.
And that's a very fine-tuning type of work, and your budget, you're going to see spending in different areas of your budget to do that fine-tuning, process refining work than the program experimentation type work. So I like to be really being aware of what mode we're in. And I think, once you are in a more stable mode where you are refining your processes, you don't need as big a reserve necessarily, because you just need what happens if the world falls apart kind of reserve. You no longer need I'm going to try 10 experiments and I'm expecting 8 of them to fail. So I need to cover my butt for those 8 failed experiments to make sure. I like to think of reserve as how much runway do I have?
Yeah.
And it's so do I want 6 months of runway? Do I want 10 months of runway? Do I only need 3 months of runway? And I think too many nonprofits are we must have this much runway. Well, it's really, to me, a matter of, how agile are you, right? How quickly, if you're in real growth mode and you're trying all different things, you can probably pivot pretty quickly and try something different to bring in money. I think startups need to really be thinking about having enough reserves before they really get started. Too many of them, I think, are kind of dribbling along. And then if you think of an airplane taking off, they run out of fuel before they even get off the runway. So when startups come to me, I'm like, whoa, sit on the runway, gather the funding, and then take off. You don't want to run out of fuel while you're on the runway, which kind of goes to like forecasting, right? Where I would totally tell my clients, hire somebody like you to really work through the nitty-gritty numbers to understand how much they need to have in order to really get lift off and not to start. It's so tempting, right? Especially when people's lives are on the lines. You want to get started right away. But you'll help more people if you make sure that you have enough resources in place to get lift off before you start. Otherwise, you're really kind of earning and wasting money. Those are a few. I'm sure there are more about.
You've said so many things that I'm just like, oh, I need to bring that up. Oh, I need to bring that up. So some of the things that I think was really significant that you said was this idea of if you're in growth mode, have reserve. And I think so many times I've seen organizations that if they're in growth mode, they have to be responsive. And let's just talk about growth mode with respect to the community needs the services, the community is willing to receive the services. And in many ways, maybe the community is willing to somehow support you in providing those services, whether it's fundraising or programmatic fees or whatever it might be. But if we want to just throw ourselves into growth mode and be responsive to that community, so often do I see these organizations, especially quasi-startup, that haven't really experienced that solid financial groundwork, right? They don't have the reserves. They're kind of limping along and they want to be the solution to everybody and they jump right in and they want to grow. But they don't have that safety net of that reserve that you were talking about. And I like when you were, referencing, have that reserve so that if you have experienced that fail, you have that runway. And I think there's a couple of things to unpack there. Number one, don't go into growth mode if you have no safety net. I've seen so many organizations just keep plowing through it. And I'm thinking this is just a disaster waiting to happen. But then number two, I want to unpack a little bit more about the idea of having reserve and looking at it through the lens of this is ways that I can experiment to create a bigger impact, to become more efficient at what I'm doing. And when I talk about my business earlier and that margin has to be a percentage because that's my safety net for experiment. I know I would have reinvested in this business and it could fail. And what's interesting is I think that's not really openly talked about in the nonprofit world. And I'll expand on that. I don't think that CEOs give themselves the latitude to experiment. I don't think the boards probably would give their blessing to experiment, knowing that maybe 8 out of 10 times they could fail, or even 1 out of 10 times they could fail. If there's any chance that there's any failure at all, the answer is going to be no. You can't reinvest and experiment. But then knowing that even if they are willing to experiment and invest in the organization, that there is an element of, there is a risk for failure. And are you in a position to weather failure? I think these are all really important questions that we should be asking ourselves as CEOs, if we've been asking ourselves as board members. And frankly, if you don't have a plan to experiment, how are you doing something wrong?
I totally agree.
Wrong. You should be. You should be.
You are. I like to say, not all nonprofits, but many nonprofits are out there to solve the world's most complex, unsolved. And in order to solve the world's most complex, unsolved problems, you need to be an incredible innovator. And in order to be an incredible innovator, you have to be an incredible experimenter. You are going to fail again and again. And at the end of the day, your nonprofit doesn't have to exist. I've had, people come to me and say, but we can't spend all our money. We at least have to save enough to keep the lights on. And I say, no, you don't. If all you're doing is keeping the lights on in your office, you should just shut down because that's not making an impact, right?
Yeah.
You don't need to exist. And if you are going to exist, you might as well play all out. And all business involves taking risks. And really, I think nonprofits should be taking more risks that even potentially than for-profits. because that's how you're going to get to amazing results, which is, I think too often people associate taking risks with being stupid, right? Don't be stupid with your money. Don't be ignorant. Don't ignore the money. Don't, cheap out and not run the scenarios. Don't not run the numbers, right? You got to run the numbers, and not everybody likes running the numbers. And if you don't, you should hire someone who does, because there's a lot you can make better. There are ways of making better guesses. And there's a phrase I really like, safe to fail experiments, and having that reserve in place so that you can afford to fail is one way that you take a smart risk. And I just want anyone out there's listening, right? When we say reserve, it is there so that you will spend it when you fail, which you will, which means you're probably doing something right. That means you're probably trying. And so it's not like you fail and I don't want people to have to go back to their boards and say, well, I failed. Can I use this money that we put in reserve? Like, the reserve is there as the safety net. What's the point of the safety net if you're not going to use it when you need it?
Right.
And it can be, flexible.
I know we're running out of time, but I know people that are listening to this are going to ask this question. I'm anticipating this question. So I love what you're saying. Plan to experiment and plan to fail. I think that's a big takeaway for me today. And then everybody's like, oh, I'm totally on board, Sarah. That sounds amazing. People that are listening, people that are founders, they're visionary people. They're innovators. Like, yes, they want to do these things. But my board has it in their mind that the reserve is a reserve. It's a safety net for, the pandemic. Coming off the heels of the pandemic doesn't really help us here. Or an economic crash that you're hearing. This is coming. It's something catastrophic. How have you been successful in reframing that for the boards that you've worked with? That listen, let's maybe be a little less rigid on how we look at our reserves, because I'm sure people buy into this idea, but if they have a board like this, which many boards are like this, how do we start reframing their mind on it?
Yeah. So one way is just talking about you're starting to reframe your organization as an innovator, and then explaining your strategy as a strategy of innovations. In the impact method, we teach this method of goal setting where we separate out what is the outcome that you don't have control over from the thing we call them execution goals, the thing that is your goal to do that you do have control over, and you're trying to get this outcome. And that's such a paradigm shift for so many people. As soon as you start separating that, almost everything we're doing, the reason why we come together as organizations, as businesses, instead of just act on our own, is because we want to have an impact on an outcome that we don't have control over. And we kind of need to team up resources in order to really get this thing to happen, this result to happen that we just don't have direct control over. And as soon as everybody starts, as soon as it starts usually with a CEO, the executive team, and then they start presenting differently to their boards, and their boards sort of, outcome, all of a sudden we're not asking, is this a good idea? We're asking, do we think it's going to produce that other thing? That's a really powerful reframing of questions. And so I really encourage people to be thinking about the outcome and always asking that question. Does the thing we want to do we think it's going to produce the result or the outcome that we want? And never, ever, ever ask your board or anybody else, do you think it's a good idea? That's
or is it practical? Is it practical idea?
Practical? That is a fast track to no city. A couple of small tweaks. I think language matters so much in talking about budgets. In that expense section that is so problematic, the board never says like, oh, we don't, think you're going to raise money. They're always concerned about the expenses. I like to label all the expense line items as revenue generating, impact generating, or just flushing it down the toilet, which is usually just, like payroll taxes. You got to pay them. They help the world in some way, but not really your organization. But as soon as you start, especially with those revenue generating expenses, because when things get scary financially, board members often want to retract and say, no, we can't spend. But it's a lot harder to cut a revenue generating expense. That doesn't sound like something we want to eliminate.
Sure.
And I can tell people that, during the pandemic, all of my clients we spent more and made more
and
did amazing financial results, amazing impact results.
Agreed.
There was so much opportunity. It was really a matter of whether or not you were ready to try something new. It was a great opportunity to try something new. It was like, oftentimes we have to create our own change moment within our organizations, and the pandemic just like created that for us. They did like a lot of the work. It did a lot of the work. So all you had to do is be willing to take advantage of that moment. And bigger organizations becoming, not just having more money, but becoming more financially sustainable, self-sustaining. So getting off of government funding. I had 2 organizations who were in serious cash flow crises because they had taken huge government funding, didn't realize the effect that would have in the following year on their cash flow, because a lot of government grants, you get the money after you spend it, and now they were not even necessarily able to spend it in order to get reimbursed. And instead of just suffering, we were able to take that moment to transform some of their relationships with their donors. I introduced them to the idea of borrowing from their donors, having one conversation about risk, and then realizing that not all money coming in is what you want. Turning down money coming in often results in more sustainability. And same with small organizations. In the middle of the pandemic, I had an organization that was so small, the executive director had to be on the board so that there would be 3 of them. She was not getting paid. And in the middle of the pandemic, within 6 months, she was getting paid. She had an assistant who was getting paid. She completely rebuilt her board, and her organization had, doubled or tripled in size financially and making an impact. And all of a sudden they're getting grants that they didn't even apply for, and donors just start coming out of woodwork and sending in checks. So, we kind of started at the beginning saying like everything's interrelated. Focusing on capacity, focusing on running well, ripples out to everything else. And I think with boards, if they feel that you have a competent plan and you start showing them proof that it's working, many of them it is fear that causes them to grip. And if they don't feel that fear anymore, they back off and they feel really excited to be a part, being able to say, I'm on the board of the organization that does that, right? Yeah. Bit of an inside view. But mostly I'm there to observe and make sure nothing's going really off the rails, right? Which is what I think boards really should be there to be watching, double checking, and if something is really horrific and it's not being addressed, they're the final line to speak up and say, that's egregious, that's horrible, this has to end. Immediately. They're I like to call them like the emergency brake on the train. If all else fails, the board needs to stop it, and they're there.
An interesting comparison. And I think what I'm hearing from all this is just the spirit of abundance. And if you're not being innovative in your journey to solve the world's problems, you kind of have to ask yourself why. I feel like if you're not going to be different or the best or unique in some way, why? Maybe there's a why, maybe there's a reason, but I really like the idea of thinking of abundance. The world is here to create capacity and expansion and make things better for you. Sometimes you have to take those leaps of faith. And I love what you said, in those spirits of being innovative and being able to reinvest in yourself to take those risks, take those leaps of faith, because, you are going to fail. Have some safety net on failing. But don't give up on failing, because that's what's going to make you the best or the most innovative or solve these problems. And what I often see, and I love your idea, and we'll kind of wrap up with this, that I remember working with an organization and they had a really large reserve, like 150% reserve. I mean, insane reserve. And they, their board was very much, we don't spend this, right? Well, the problem is they wanted to become the most innovative, provider of mental health services for trauma-focused, like children's therapy, basically. And that meant that they had to invest in training. They wholeheartedly believed was going to revolutionize the work that they were doing, but it wasn't considered an evidence-based practice yet. It was still kind of in its trial periods, if you will. But they believed wholeheartedly. But it was going to cost them more like $100,000. Well, because it wasn't evidence-based, no funder was going to give the money for the team to be trained and implement this new process within their work. So the only way they were able to successfully do that was to go to the board and basically say, if we really do want to be innovative, if we do really want to be the best, then we have to be willing to invest this in ourselves. The board signed off on it. Happy to report. They just built this huge therapeutic preschool. It's pretty renowned here now in this market. And hopefully it's going to be extremely successful. But if they didn't have those reserves and they didn't have that board buying into that kind of innovative player within this space, and they weren't willing to take the risk, they very well could have gotten into the training and I don't know, realized it wasn't a good fit, and they might have spent $100,000 and maybe it was going nowhere. But it didn't. It was successful. And now they're kind of known for this kind of work in their space. So I love all of these little nuggets of takeaways. And I'm sure you have more. Sarah, tell us a little bit more about Pivot Ground, the work that you're doing. And if nonprofits are listening and they want to connect with you about the training that you do, the coaching that you might offer, and any other resources that these CEOs can start incorporating into their conversations with their own board or staff to change some of this narrative, how would they get a hold of you? What's the best way?
Yeah, the best way is go to pivotground.com. You'll find lots of free resources on there. You will find I periodically offer a training, a very low cost training for board members. So if you're thinking, I want my board to hear this, but I'm not sure we're going to think, it's not named how to get your board not to approve your budgets. It's named, how high impact nonprofits can change the way they operate their boards. I'm probably messing up the name a little, but it's enticing to board members. So if you're thinking you want your board members to hear this in a training that's for them from me, you'll find that easily on the website. And if you're like, oh my God, I want to dive in and work with Sarah and have so much more money and more fun, I'm back in my day, and I want to be able to take vacations again, and I want everybody in my nonprofit to be happier and healthier while making an even bigger impact, click on the apply button at pivotground.com. You will, if you're approved, you will get access to a pretty substantial training that I provide, and you'll get all the information about the program that I was talking about called Thrive with my clients, and that is where you can work with me very closely for an extended period of time to really make all these kinds of changes in your organization as a CEO and with your board as well.
I love all of that, Sarah. Thank you again for joining us. This has been really interesting conversation. I love geeking out on all these and challenging the norm and what we've always done in the spirit of moving into uncharted territory that nobody's ever done. I can really relate to that. I started a business that everybody said would fail, and it hasn't, and it's thrived. And the only way to do that is to take leaps, have a lot of faith, and do things that other people aren't willing to do. So I love this conversation. Thanks again. And thank you all for listening. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel, subscribe to our YouTube, and you'll get updates on all of our other episodes. Thanks, friends.
Thank you for listening to a Modern Nonprofit podcast powered by the Charity CFO. If your nonprofit is needing help with accounting or bookkeeping, head on over to thecharitycfo.com to find information on the work we are doing with other nonprofits. If you found this information helpful, please give us a 5-star rating on your podcast streaming platform so other nonprofit leaders can find us. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.